Thank you. And thank you all for coming today on, during this summer session when you guys don't typically meet, so I really appreciate it. So today I'm going to talk about a study that we've recently completed looking at mindfulness training in infantry Marines. So I'll have your typical outline where I'll present some of the background and rationale for why we conducted this study. I'll go over the methods, present a few different results, and then leave time for conclusion and questions at the end. So really, our lab, when it boils down to it, we're very much interested in resilience. And so I thought I would spend at least one slide talking a little bit about how we conceptualize resilience. And really what we're talking about when I say resilience is more of a psychological construct. So it's the ability to positively adapt to a severe stressor. And it's a complex construct. It involves multiple facets such as temperament and personality, cognitive functions, and access to environmental resources. And really what the research has found is that individuals that have more resilience are better able to handle stress, and they're less likely to develop psychopathology following exposure to extreme stressors. So why do we care about resilience? Sorry, let's see here. Can you guys hear me? Okay, great. Really, I think a major area of research that's been ongoing and that's still in development is to really better quantify and make more objective measures of what resilience is. As I mentioned in the previous slide, it is a really complex construct with more subjective sort of descriptors at times. And the second reason is really to identify brain regions and cognitive abilities or functions that can be targeted for modification through training in order to help build resilience in individuals that are at increased risk for exposure to stressful situations. And so one way that our lab has been looking at this construct of resilience is through interoceptive processing. And interoception really refers to the sensing and representation of sensations from within the body. So these are things like your breathing rate, or how hungry or thirsty you are, or whether or not you have an itch on your arm, or you need to cough and there's sort of a tickle in your throat. So it's all these sort of internal sensations. And we know that these body relevant processes are sort of ongoing and integrated in the insula. And the information actually travels from a posterior to an anterior pattern of integration, where the posterior insula here receives physiological signals from within inside the body. And as it's integrated more anteriorly, it's sort of an integration of thinking and feeling and anticipating what's going to happen. So that information is integrated in the anterior insula, and then it's actually communicated to the anterior cingulate cortex. And really what the insula is transmitting is kind of what's going on in the body right now. And this helps the ACC prepare the body to sort of take action in order to maintain homeostasis within the system. So here's an example. So say you wake up every morning, or you know you had to come to this talk this afternoon. It's 5 o'clock and you want to be awake. So you decide you're going to get Starbucks coffee around 2 o'clock, and you're anticipating and you're expecting to feel really awake after that coffee. When in actuality, you're feeling not so awake. Maybe you're getting ready to fall asleep. Maybe it's the sound of my voice, but all of a sudden you're feeling very tired. This information is integrated in the anterior cingulate cortex, like what's happening in my body right now. And that's transmitted to the ACC, where you're saying, I predicted that I was going to be more awake, but I'm actually asleep. So, maybe something was going on with my coffee. Maybe the barista actually gave me decaf instead of my regular caffeinated beverage that I needed in order to stay awake. So it's this current body state, the anticipation of where the body state's going to be, and then the integration of this information in order for the system to sort of maintain a balance within the system. So really, it's the body's way of monitoring, regulating, and maintaining this homeostasis in the face of a changing environment or a stressful environment. And one way that we've really tapped into this system is by using this task called the inspiratory breathing load task. So I'll explain the task first here on the left-hand side. So you can see the figure up on the screen, and our participants are fitted with a nose clip. This prevents them from breathing in and out through their nose, and then they're fitted with a breathing tube. And you can see here that at the end of the breathing tube is a little stopper. So for the most part, an individual can breathe freely in and out through the tube. And so during this task, I'll get back to the stopper in a second. During this task, the participants actually, it's a continuous performance task where they're responding basically to the direction of an arrow. And that's really, it's a very easy task. It's not designed to be stressful at all. We just want them to pay attention to the screen. Because what the screen is also telling them is when it's blue, their breathing is not restricted at all. However, when it turns yellow, there's a 25% chance that someone on the end of this tube right here is going to plug their breathing and make it very difficult for them to breathe in. Again, that's only a 25% chance. So this allows us to look at an anticipation period as well as a breathing load period. So they're not always going to receive a breathing load when it turns yellow, only sometimes. So not only can we look at baseline anticipation and breathing load, but we can look at a breathing load recovery as well. So it's a really nice task that breaks down into different component processes that we can actually then go in and look at. How does the body sort of anticipate a stressor, respond to a stressor, and recover from a stressor? And this is a functional magnetic resonance bold brain response image to the task itself. And you can see here, this is just the overall task effect, that we get really robust activation in the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, two regions that we know are involved in interoceptive processing. And as Dr. Judd was saying, Dr. Brewer was saying, I'm confusing you with Lou Judd at UCSD. Dr. Brewer was saying earlier, we have done several studies looking at elite performers and how they process this interoceptive information. And we found that in several of these studies, or in fact all of these studies, that there really is this relationship between individuals that are highly resilient and the way that their brains process aversive interoceptive information. We've looked at adventure racers, which I'll have a slide on next. We've also recently scanned Diana Nyad. She's this amazing 64-year-old woman that swam from Cuba to Florida. We've done this with Navy SEALs, several Red Bull athletes, and BMX Olympic cyclists, as well as Olympic swimmers. And we see a very consistent pattern of activation in response to this task. What we see is, on the right is, so this is a percent signal change activation in response to the breathing load task that I just talked about. And in the red, you can see the adventure racers, and in the blue, you can see our control individuals. And what we found across multiple groups was sort of an amplification during the anticipation period, sort of the brain's getting ready and sort of preparing for a potential aversive experience, and a much more attenuated brain activation during the load itself, so during the stressor, and the post-load recovery period relative to the control groups. And again, we're seeing this very consistently across our elite performers that we've looked at. So these individuals who are highly resilient show this attenuated brain activation, suggesting that these might be brain regions to target for modification through training. And so what Dr. Paulus and Dr. Johnson were very much interested in is to see if mindfulness could be used as a training technique to modify these brain regions involved in interoception. And I know I probably don't need to spend very much time with this group going over the definition of mindfulness, but we know that it involves regulated attention and knowledge that sort of events are momentary in time, and then a lack of an emotional or cognitive appraisal to such events. Research has consistently found that mindfulness training reduces stress in individuals with chronic medical and mental health conditions. And mindfulness, interestingly, also results in both functional and anatomical changes in the brain regions that we know are involved in interoceptive processing. So on the left here, you can see increased cortical thickness in the right anterior insula. And on the right, this is a functional activation map looking at experienced meditators. And you can see the increased activation in both the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. Again, the two regions that we have consistently found to be activated in response to the breathing load task. We had a unique opportunity to work with the military population. Being in San Diego, we have all branches of the military there. So we have Marines, we have Navy SEALs, we have the Navy itself. And so we kind of are inundated with military. And we know that the military, active duty military, are at increased risk for exposure to stressful environments. So they're having cognitive, emotional, as well as physiological compromise in these situations. And you can see here, this is just sort of an example of the cognitive degradation following a 72-hour training period with the Rangers. This is percent degradation of a 4-choice reaction time, so it's sort of like a cognitive task. And you can see that the Rangers over here are performing significantly worse than individuals that are hypoglycemic and individuals that are legally intoxicated. So exposure to these environments have very adverse effects on one's ability to function. Right? They're very stressful experiences, and I'll go into a little bit more detail in terms of some of the training environments that they have to that they're exposed to. So, primary aim of the current study that I'm going to talk about is to really investigate whether mindfulness training may have some beneficial effects in military populations that are relatively healthy, but we know are going to be exposed to these stressful environments. So we really are interested to see if there's going to be any modulation of brain activation in the interoceptive system in these individuals following mindfulness training. I'm also going to present data on another, so this is quite a large study. Both of these sort of aims have been published, and I'm going to also present data on some more exploratory aims that sort of I have not actually, I wasn't actually the primary author on this study, but we have data looking at physiology, some other biomarkers of stress, as well as some behavioral measures. So I'm going to try and integrate that information. They're different sample sizes, but it provides a unique and sort of compelling story about the beneficial effects that we're seeing in mindfulness training in Marines. So hopefully I'll be able to answer questions pertaining to this data if you guys have any in more detail. So with regards to the methods, this was a study where we had a convenient sample of 2 infantry battalions, and they were scheduled to undergo pre-deployment training. This is a 3-month training period that every Marine goes through prior to deployment, and these individuals were preparing for deployment in Afghanistan. So the battalions are broken down into platoons. There was 4 platoons that were assigned to a mindfulness training program and 4 platoons that were assigned to a control group. So they didn't receive any additional training. And then from those larger sample sizes, we were able to scan 21 Marines from the mindfulness group and 21 Marines from the control group. These individuals volunteered to be scanned. However, they did not volunteer to be in the mindfulness group. So it's unique in some respect because these individuals are really naive to what mindfulness is. They're not seeking it out on their own. This is something that was just integrated into their training environment. And here's a little bit about the design of the study. So prior to the start of the 3-month training platform, they underwent assessment, so behavioral questionnaires were administered, blood was taken, and they underwent fMRI where they received and went through sort of our standard protocol, one of the tasks being the inspiratory breathing load that I talked about. Then they received either an 8-week mindfulness training program or no additional training. They underwent an additional assessment where they're, again, just getting blood work done and completing some questionnaires. Then at time point 3, so this is about 5 to 10 days following their mindfulness training, they underwent what's called an Infantry Immersive trainer, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in 2 slides. It's really a training platform designed to stress out the Marines. It's a whole day, and it's extremely stressful for them. And then they had assessment following that, again, heart rate monitoring, blood work, questionnaires, things like that. And then about 14 days after this stressor, they were scanned again. So total time is about 3 months from the beginning of their training platform all the way to the end. I was not involved in the mindfulness training itself, so I'm going to go over the slides with you and hopefully answer any questions that you might have about the actual program. What I can tell you is that it was based largely on the MBSR program, and it was administered by Elizabeth Stanley. She has former experience as an officer and has experience with MBSR and working with trauma-resilient patients. Again, it contains many of the same features as MBSR. It's a 20-hour course taught over 8 weeks. There's 8 sessions, 2 hours a day, and then there's a 4-hour workshop with a silent practice. And then they were asked to do daily homework. Again, just sort of to keep in mind, these individuals weren't seeking out a mindfulness training per se. This is part of their training. While I don't have data pertaining to the actual amount of homework that they did each week, all I can say is that they were at the class once a week for 2 hours. Which is important because there's been a number of studies, as you know, that have documented that longer practices is associated with greater brain changes and greater behavioral changes as well, or more consistent practice. And I will say that also that the components are really geared towards the military environment. So it was mindfulness for Marines, really, where they talked about concrete application to their training environment. How are they going to translate a mindfulness concept or technique to what they're doing in the field? So the Infantry Immersive trainer that I talked about earlier, again, is it's a stressful environment. It's a 1-day training platform where they're exposed to a mock village, and there's a series of increasingly complex scenarios that they go through. So the first one would be just a passive village control. So there are actors there that are dressed up in Afghani garb and have guns, and there's village leaders that hang out. There's it's an environment that really does translate to when they're actually deployed. So, for example, the first one's going to be they're doing a passive village control. The second one, they have to actually engage with the village leaders. And then the third one, they're doing a complex ambush where they're actually engaging in crossfire with the actors that are there. Close quarters combat scenarios, simulations, which are training ammunitions, and realistic sensory and environmental stimuli. Some of the measures that I'll be presenting on, some of the data that was collected as part of this study, we have the interoceptive task. So again, we're using this interoceptive breathing restriction task as our Insula probe. We are also looking at some biomarkers, some stress biomarkers, norepinephrine and MPY, and then some physiological measures, so heart rate and breathing rate during the infantry immersive trainer, and then some behavioral questionnaires, sleep quality, resilience characteristics, and mindfulness questionnaires. So I went over most of this prior in the previous slide, so I won't really go back over it, but again, just to remind you, this is the breathing restriction task. And again, it is an aversive experience. It feels as though one's breathing in through a straw, but the exhalation is not restricted, which actually is good for a bold response because it doesn't affect O2 levels in the brain. And I have some data at the end if anyone is interested in seeing that, although I'm not presenting it formally, but it's not going to affect the bold response in the brain. During the CPT task, we also get, so the task where they're responding to the direction of an arrow, we're getting accuracy as well as reaction time. Again, the task itself is not designed to be difficult. And then we have more behavioral component to this measure where we're actually looking at their ratings of how unpleasant, pleasant, or intense the breathing restriction is, and we collect this prior to the scan, so we're not collecting it during the scan itself. But they're rating that on a visual analog scale. They rated 16 different dimensions, but I'm only going to present the pleasant, unpleasant, and intense ratings today. And in terms of our fMRI analyses, I can go into more detail, but really just to let you know that we used anatomically constrained a priori regions of interest. So we have data on this paradigm. We know that it actively recruits or engages the insula and anterior cingulate cortex. We know that these regions are involved in mindfulness training, and so these are the regions that we're very much interested in. So we restricted the analysis to these two regions. And we also did our group level analysis in R. With regards to the biomarkers, we have plasma concentrations of neuropeptide Y and norepinephrine. NPY is co-released with norepinephrine. It's an indicator of sympathetic activation. It's released during intense or prolonged sympathetic activation. And it's a well-known stress modulator. We also have heart rate and breathing rate. These were collected at the Infantry Immersive Trainer 45 minutes prior to the training environment, 10 minutes prior, 30 minutes in, 10 minutes after the recovery, and 45 minutes after. Sorry, 10 minutes and then 45 minutes after the exercise. And then the behavioral questionnaires, although they probably received about 20 or 30, this, like I said, was a very large study. I felt like we should restrict it to the mindfulness questionnaire, response to stressful experiences, and the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Scale. And the Sleep Quality Scale is very important to military environment. They are very interested in applied research. One thing that every single active duty infantry, Marine, SEAL, individual personnel goes through is sleep degradation. So it's a chronic problem for them. So this is definitely something that they're very interested in. So I'll go over the results now. And this is for, I should highlight, so we have a larger cohort, and the imaging data and the self-report questionnaire data that I'm going to present is on the smaller neuroimaging cohort. The biomarkers, the physiology are going to be on the larger cohorts because we have that data. We couldn't scan everyone, unfortunately. So for the imaging data set, you can see that MFIT is the mindfulness-based mind fitness training. It's the mindfulness training that's very similar to MBSR. And that's the MFIT group, and this is the control group. So you can see here that there's no significant difference between age or years of education. And unfortunately, we did not find any differences on any of the questionnaire data. I can say that with the larger cohort, there was an improvement with sleep quality in the individuals that received mindfulness training. It was still clinically below where it should be, but they were getting an hour more of sleep each night, which is actually pretty significant functionally, and maybe not on the questionnaire, but it definitely had an improvement in their sleep. So the ratings were they were actually rating the breathing restriction itself, as you would expect. As prior to entering the scanner, we gave them different breathing load conditions. 40 is what we used inside the scanner. It's the most restriction. And as you can see, the more you restrict it, the more unpleasant it becomes, or the less pleasant, more unpleasant, and more intense it becomes, as you would expect. And there was an affective latency. So this is the reaction time to the continuous performance test, where they're responding to the direction of an arrow. You can see increased latency periods for anticipation and the anticipation of the actual breathing load itself and the recovery from the breathing load. But there was no group differences. And there's no differences in accuracy. And again, we weren't really expecting to see any differences in performance because it is such an easy task. In terms of the neuroimaging data, I'll be presenting the data on the right insula as well as the anterior cingulate cortex, but we also had a difference in the left medial frontal gyrus, which was consistent with both the insula and the ACC. But that's just to sort of present the volume as well as the coordinates. So what you can see here, again, just to throw the task up on the right, these are a group by time interaction effect. We did not have a group by time by condition effect. So what you're seeing here is an overall effect to the task itself. Unfortunately, we did not have enough power to detect differences that we're looking at anticipation versus the load versus the recovery. And this is percent signal change. This is our control group, and this is the mindfulness group. And you can see between time point 1, so prior to any sort of training, and post mindfulness training on this one, there's no significant change. So this is over that 3-month training period. The control group does not show a change. However, the mindfulness group shows a decreased response to the aversive interoceptive experience. And we see a similar pattern of activation in the anterior cingulate cortex, where here we're actually seeing, although not significant, an increase in ACC activation in the control group, but we're seeing a decrease in activation in the anterior cingulate cortex within the mindfulness group. So just to bring it back a little bit, this very much falls in line with what we have been seeing in our highly resilient elite performers, where they're showing, relative to a control group, a much more attenuated response within the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, suggesting that they process information more similarly, and that this might actually be sort of a neural signature of resilience. Now I'll just switch over a little bit to the data that I don't know as much about, but I would be happy to answer any questions if I can. The physiology. And so what we're seeing here, this is the heart rate during the infantry immersive trainer. And what we're seeing is at 10 minutes prior to the IIT, the mindfulness group actually shows increased heart rate. It does not stand when they're actually experiencing the stressor itself, but they do show a greater recovery of heart rate function relative to the control group. That difference does not last, though, at rest 45 minutes after. So again, greater heart rate prior to the stressor itself, and greater recovery of function in the mindfulness group relative to the control group. In terms of breathing rate, again, no real differences here prior to the IIT or during the IIT itself, but as you would maybe hypothesize, we're seeing a quicker recovery in breathing rate 10 minutes following the stressful experience, and that continues even 45 minutes after that experience. With regards to neuropeptide Y, the control group had significantly higher levels of neuropeptide Y 45 minutes after the stressful training environment, and the mindfulness group recovered to near baseline levels. And there was no significant differences for norepinephrine between the two groups. So I just want to highlight a few of the conclusions. So mindfulness training, again, did not modulate any of the self-report assessments, unfortunately. It did result in the larger cohort in improved sleep quality, but no differences were observed in any of the other self-report measures. We also did not see any differences in the actual ratings of the pleasantness or intensity of the breathing restriction task or task performance. But we did see a greater response to stress followed by a quicker recovery in the mindfulness group with regards to the heart rate and breathing rate during the exposure to the stressful stimulated environment. And in the mindfulness group actually demonstrated faster recovery of sympathetic function following exposure to a stressful environment. And the mindfulness training resulted in decreased activation in both the insula and ACC in response to the aversive interoceptive experience, which may actually represent a more efficient neural processing in response to these stressors. So taken together, really, what I think both studies have shown is that mindfulness training is actually beneficial. It shows we have beneficial effects across multiple domains that indicate enhanced recovery following the exposure to stressful environments. And this is, I think, uniquely in sort of an important point was that this is a non-clinical sample. These are individuals that are not even, I mean, they might have been interested, but as far as I know, weren't even remotely interested in mindfulness training. and are being exposed to mindfulness, and we're seeing this recovery of function in these individuals, suggesting that mindfulness training actually might be a good intervention for individuals even before they're exposed to a stressful environment. It may actually serve as a training technique to help modulate the brain's response to stressors, which might help to improve coping abilities. So that's really all I had today. These studies were actually, the PIs were Martin Paulus and Chris Johnson. They're my direct supervisors. I also worked pretty closely with Dr. Alan Simmons and Dr. Jennifer Stewart on the data analysis. And then our one head RA is Akanksha Shukla, and then want to say thank you to the military personnel who participated in the study. The funding, my funding was from NIMH T32, Biological Psychiatry and Neuroscience Fellowship, but of course we received funding from the Office of Naval Research as well in order to conduct the research. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. Will you be following the participants over time, or is this the end of the study?
So we have, we actually have a time 3 data collection point where we scan them a year later. I have not had time to look at that data. And with regards to the mindfulness training, unfortunately, I don't, maybe 1 or 2 of them continue to practice following that time. I have looked at a different task. We have a Hariri emotion face processing task that I've actually looked at. And basically in that experiment or in that task, you're responding to, you have a target face and you have 2 other faces at the bottom of the screen. And you're trying to match the emotion of the face to the bottom to the one on the top. And so it's a really simple task. It's just emotion face processing. And what we found was that and unfortunately I probably don't remember all of the brain regions that we've looked at because this is probably about a year ago. Some brain regions maintained the decrease in activation. Some went back up to where they were prior to, and others didn't. We didn't even see a difference until the 3rd year or until the 3rd scan. So it was a very different pattern of activation where we saw some of them staying the same and others sort of going in different directions. We did just finish a study where, very similar study to this, but we have an active control group. So that's one unfortunate side, aspect of this study is that the guys who received the mindfulness training, they got 20 extra hours of attention, which not all of them liked that much because they wanted to be doing other stuff. So they were still required to do the same thing, right? They had to go and clean their room and clean their guns and all that stuff, which takes a long time. So unfortunately, we don't have an active control group in this study, but we just finished collecting data, I would say probably 4 weeks ago, where we have a sports psychology group as well. So they get 20 hours of a completely different sort of program that's designed to sort of improve their performance overall. So that's going to be something that we'll be very interested in looking at. And, we could technically, I think we could follow up with some of these individuals, but it would have to be through medical records. We don't have an IRB set up to like follow these guys any further. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, folks are thinking one. I'll ask one. I was curious. Maybe I have 2 questions. I saw that you had 2 operatory regions of interest, and then you had listed maybe 1 or 2 other regions where you found some differences. Did you all look in an exploratory fashion at any other brain regions or look across the whole brain for differences between the groups?
We did do a whole brain analysis. And I think with, I don't actually remember everything that we found, but we definitely still had ACC activation in the whole brain analysis. I don't think that the Insula survived the whole brain analysis.
How would you interpret that?
How would I interpret not finding the Insula activation? Unfortunate. No, but I don't know. I mean, it could. it could just, I mean, we clearly found it when we were able to, basically what happened was we controlled for the smaller voxel region, and so it gave us a more lenient threshold. So, yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you're seeing definite brain regional differences, yet the self-report measures are not showing much of a difference between the groups. And I could see that being interpreted in several different ways in terms of, whether self-reports aren't particularly good at tapping into certain things or whatnot. But I'm curious what you're thinking about that in terms of whereas these self-reports aren't showing it, but you are seeing clear brain difference.
I think it was, I mean, definitely where you're going was that maybe they're just not as sensitive to the changes that we're seeing in brain activation. So clearly there's a number of studies that would suggest, so what we're seeing with the neuropsych data, so we have neuropsych data and we're looking at resilience, and we're not seeing any differences there either. And so our interpretation really is that there might not be any cognitive differences. There might be differences in this cohort, and maybe they're just not really good at reporting it. So I think that the brain imaging data is just potentially more sensitive to those changes. But you would anticipate and you would expect, you would be hypothesizing that there would be a difference in mindfulness. We did find, although it's not significantly different, the little blip here in perceived mindfulness, after you start mindfulness training, you realize how bad you are at it. So there is a little bit of a change there. So they're reporting that they're pretty much worse at being mindful overall. But to get back to your question, I would say that the brain imaging measures might just be a little bit more sensitive than some of the self-report questionnaires. And this is an environment also where they don't self-report very easily, right? So if you ask them if they're depressed or if they're sad, you might just get a very similar response across all of those questions, despite there actually being some change. And there were quite a few things that, not in these questionnaires, but in general, like that with the BDI, they didn't want us asking them certain questions. So I think this is a cohort that is less likely to sort of maybe answer truthfully. I don't want to say they're lying, but they might just not be as open to answering some of the questions. So
their standard response might be, "I'm fine."
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. Thanks.
Right. Or what is this mindfulness stuff? No, I don't notice a difference. Or you definitely, and just sort of as a side note, did get a little. It was interesting, to talk to some of these guys. I wasn't there in the class itself, but to hear the response to mindfulness training. And some of them loved it, and some of them said, it was just a waste of my time. But I think that that's the unique aspect of this study, is that we're getting these individuals who aren't seeking out mindfulness training on their own, and yet we're still showing these neural activation, these changes in the brain.
Were you able to segregate it all by folks that had buy-in versus folks that didn't? I'm guessing your groups are pretty small.
Yeah.
But that would be an interesting thing to look at.
Yeah, that would have been interesting. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Mm-hmm. Other questions?
Yeah.
There we go. I guess similarly along that line, as far as the cohort was going, were you able to segregate by folks who had already been deployed versus never been deployed?
I would say all of these guys had been deployed before.
Okay, I guess that's what I was wondering. Is there any kind of confounders there for folks who were saying, oh, this isn't doing anything for me, but they hadn't actually seen combat yet, versus people who had already been through actual stress? Yeah, we gave them a deployment questionnaire, and one of the facets is exposure to stressful situations, and I don't think there were any differences on that measure. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not super familiar with the Insula literature, so bear with me. But it's curious to me that you saw a decrease in insula activation with the folks that went through the MFIT protocol, given that if it is similar to MBSR, it focuses largely on body awareness.
Mm-hmm.
So does the literature say that right insula activation is correlated with aversive sensations, or is it also correlated with pleasurable sensations? Is it correlated with increased sensitivity? What I would expect from the MBSR protocol, at least, is increased sensitivity, decreased reactivity. So I do find it interesting that you're seeing a dampening in both the ACC and Insula.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the literature is somewhat mixed. There's definitely a number of studies of FARB, and the whole group have found increased activation in the intra-insula in response to sort of an interoceptive awareness task inside the scanner, where they were asked to lay still and sort of focus on their breathing. It could be that we're seeing differences because of differences in task, where this is an aversive experience versus just having somebody actually focus on their breath. So that's one potential confounding factor there. But yeah, there are a number of studies out there that have shown increased activation in these sort of interoceptive brain regions relative to sort of the exteroceptive, sort of outside awareness processing. So yeah.
Similar with the ACC, which I would expect increased ACC activation following any protocol that teaches you to pay attention with better acuity.
Yeah.
So I would love to see a control for just spacing out and checking out of an aversive stimulus.
Yeah. And that could be their way of sort of coping with or dealing with the stimulus at the time. Yeah.
And potentially, it would be a maladaptive response for soldiers to zone out in the midst of aversive stimulus. So it'd just be great to include maybe some attentional task or something to show or test if they are still maintaining vigilance.
Well, it's funny you say that, because that's their go-to a lot, is to check out, because and that's what some of the guys, just as a side note, would say, you asked me to focus on stuff I never wanted to focus on. And so what we could be seeing in these individuals is sort of an aversive reaction to bringing all of that stuff into their awareness versus the way they normally cope with it, which is to suppress or to try and push away, which we all, as psychiatrists and therapists and researchers, know that suppression is just going to rear back up, right? So it could be that over time that maybe they're going to have a better reaction or a different reaction neurally if they kept up practice or sort of got a little bit more into the practice itself, mindfulness practice. And that could be a confounding factor too. I mean, these individuals, they came to a group, right? They came to their 2-hour training session every week, but I'm not aware of any one of them going home and practicing like somebody who sought out mindfulness training on their own would do. Right, somebody that's invested in the experience itself and in the practice itself. So I think there are a number of confounding factors that could partially explain the differences that we're seeing. And it could also be that they're just sort of checking out, like you said, and suppressing during this time. It would be interesting to put in a group of meditators and have them go through a similar aversive experience.
Absolutely.
I do know that, I don't remember who published right off the top of my head, but there have been a number of pain studies looking at Zen meditators, and what they see is an enhanced activation in response to pain itself, suggesting that you're saying that they're more aware because they're more focused and they're sort of more in tune with that interoceptive processing. So like you said, it could be that they're checking out.
Great, thank you.
Well, if there aren't any other, maybe we can just thank Lori again for her wonderful talk.
Thank you.